Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Pingdom. I'm John Voorhees, and with me as always is Federico Vitici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I am doing all right. And you know what, Federico? I think today we're going to shake things up a little bit, and we're going to talk about a broader topic. We're going to talk about design today. And I wanted to start with you by telling a little story to kind of set the stage for this.
Oh, is this an animal story?
No, I wish it were an animal story. I couldn't come up with a good animal story. And
for listeners of App Stories who don't know the reference, we have a show for Club Mac Stories members. It's called Mac Stories Unplugged. And it's a sort of behind the scenes, sort of making of, taking a look at what we do at Mac Stories. And it's a more casual and usually longer than App Stories conversation that John and I do twice a month. And for the past few episodes, John has been telling some really fascinating and very interesting wildlife / animal stories. John is quite the outdoorsy person, it turns out, and he's had many encounters with different forms of wildlife.
I have had encounters, but I don't think you could call me an outdoorsy person. I'm kind of, my whole family is kind of like a city dwellers by far.
Well,
but
maybe in your youth, John. I mean, you've seen like penguins in Chile or something. Like
that is true.
You've been to places. You've been to many places.
I have been to places, and I'll tell you, those penguins smell. But that's a story. That's a story for Club Mac Stories members. We'll leave it at that. All right.
Sure.
Federico.
So if you want to hear about smelly penguins, please subscribe.
Yeah, you're really selling it today, Federico.
Yes,
good job. Well done. Well done.
Thank you. It's the penguins.
It is the penguins. All right, Federico. This is a story about your birthday, because I know you've got a birthday coming up.
Where is this going?
You've got a birthday coming up, and I want you to imagine that forget about this whole pandemic thing and the fact that there's an Atlantic Ocean between you and me. Just pretend I said, you know what, Federico, come over on your birthday. I'm baking you a birthday cake.
Sure.
And,
okay.
And you would hopefully graciously say yes and come over to get your big slice of birthday cake. And you would probably have in your mind what that cake might be, what it might look like, you have certain expectations when you come to a birthday cake, right? It might be, right? It might be round, kind of cylindrical. You might wonder whether it's chocolate or some other flavor. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a square cake. I mean, there are a few things it could be, but you'd have, within parameters, you'd have an idea of what that cake would be. But imagine, if you will, you showed up and sitting on the table was not what you were expecting, but it was this blob of cake-like stuff where the frosting was in the middle and the
cake-like stuff. Wow.
And the candles were poking out all different directions, and you're like, well, what's that? And it might taste like a birthday cake, but it certainly didn't look like a birthday cake. It certainly wasn't designed like a birthday cake. And I say that.
Is it you trying to explain that you've done a horrible job doing a birthday cake?
No. I'm actually pretty good at baking a birthday cake, so I'll make you a good one someday. But what I'm trying to get at is kind of the form and function distinction a little bit. Right?
Wow.
And what people anticipate when they come to certain kinds of apps, just like when they come with an anticipation of a certain kind of birthday cake, what it's going to be like. And when making variations from that makes sense and is good and is interesting and might be innovative, and when it's just plain a bad idea. Like, I think the birthday cake, with the frosting on the inside and just like a blob of cake with candles sticking out everywhere, probably not a good idea. It might taste okay, but it's not what you'd be expecting for a birthday cake. So I want to start there because, to me, design fits into a couple of different categories. One is just how something looks. It's the decoration. It's the gloss on top of the actual code and how things work. And the other part of it is also how it works. How, whether it is easy to use and whether it does things in a way that fit with your model of what you're trying to accomplish, that sort of thing. That's what I really want to talk about today, because it seems to me that balancing those two sorts of things is really hard. And we've seen it since the beginning of the App Store in particular. We've been through lots of different cycles of different kinds of fashion in terms of what apps look like, as well as a bunch of different changes to the design of apps and the way they work, which are based in large measure on the APIs as they become available and Apple changes things under the hood. What do you think?
That is quite the metaphor, John, and I really like it. I mean, me coming to you would be the user going to the App Store to download an app they're looking for, and that would be me having this journey to your house to get my birthday cake, and then going to the App Store, downloading the app, and it looks like an app, it behaves like an app, but then you start using it, and it's not what you were expecting. So I had no idea where you were going with the birthday cake. And I still maintain my skepticism regarding your birthday cake baking skills. However, I really like the metaphor. I think it was a really good metaphor.
So where should we start with this? Because I guess maybe we start with the surface stuff, the decoration. Because to me, we lived through the skeuomorphic days which I think made an awful lot of sense at the beginning of the iPhone's life, because, the whole conceit of the iPhone is that it's a phone. It's not really a phone. It's a little tiny computer in your pocket. And sure, you make phone calls with it, but it's so much more than that. But it was such a new device to so many people that having a lot of designs that were built upon real world analogs, whether it was bookshelves or sliding switches or all these different things that had analogs in the real world, it made it easier for people to learn how to use them. And I think that made a lot of sense then. And of course, we then migrated away from that and into things like the flat design of iOS 7, which was a really a wild swing in the opposite direction. That got toned down over time. And now we're somewhere in between. And I think we're starting to see a little bit more of a shift, and it's a shift that's maybe not focused necessarily just on what the iPhone or the iPad is all about, but it's focused on what the watch and the iPhone and the iPad and the Mac, how it all works and fits together on kind of a continuum from the smallest device that Apple makes to, the ones with the biggest screens. And, I think that's a different, it's a different driver of where design is going today. But, it's interesting to me how especially on the surface, the design of apps has really gone through a lot of changes that are really driven in part by just fashion and what designers like at any given time.
Yeah, I remember I was recently reading again my coverage of iOS 7 from 2013, so that's 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't feel like it. And something that stood out to me is how at the time the iOS 7 transition was sold to us as a way to put the focus on different ideas, different principles, but really one in particular, which is emphasizing content. And so putting the focus on the content instead of the UI Chrome surrounding it. And that idea at the time, it sort of made sense. And especially because we had reached the point where some of the UIs that we had in the iOS 5 and iOS 6 era were maybe going a little too much in the photorealistic direction. I mean, we're talking here the Apple Podcast app for iOS 6 with the physical, tape reel, the 3D animation, and of course notes and reminders with the leather-bound sidebar that contained your lists, all that kind of stuff. At the time, it sort of made sense to say, okay, we need to take a step back. We've gone a little too far in this direction of trying to mimic the real world for the sake of familiarity, but now we're gone, oh no, this is a little too much. We need to take a step back and reassess the role of our user interface. And so in 2013, Apple said, we designed a new interface that is striking, that is bold, that is radically new. And one of the core principles of it is we're going to put the focus on content. There was this idea of clarity, trying to make it as clear as possible what what the user content was. And by content, I mean an email message or a note or a document or a web page, and try and let the UI recede to emphasize the content. And I think it's sort of funny, if you think about it, how 7 years later, we're still having the same conversation. We're still having the same conversation in iOS 14 with this idea of compact UI, of Apple coming out and saying, well, we wanted to emphasize the content. And so
right.
we decided to let the UI take a step back and recede in the background and emphasize what really matters to the user. But I think there are some key differences here.
Mm-hmm.
I think over the past 7 years, of course, the iOS 7 design language has changed a lot, to the point where even though Apple didn't explicitly come out and say, we are launching a brand new design on iOS, over the years, on every single release, and even in point updates during the year, they have consistently and judiciously refreshed the iOS 7 design language. Some might say they have walked back some decisions from that era, and I think to an extent it is true. But what's different in 2020 is that over the years we have, the iOS 7 design has been refined to the point where in many places around iOS, it's much more clear than it was years ago. For example, what's a button? And we have outlines again, and we have drop shadows, and we have bolder typography, and we have bolder iconography. We have color in icons now with SF symbols and multicolor glyphs. We have 3D elements again. So a lot of the criticism that were true for iOS 7 have been rectified. However, I think we're also now in a situation where Apple needs to say, we want to put the focus on the content, and we want to have this UI that is more compact, because I feel like they are considering the next 7 years, right? So imagine iOS and iPadOS 2027, so 7 years from now. It's very possible that Apple will have new devices out by then, and it's very possible that one of those devices will be a headset, an augmented reality or virtual reality headset. So in the context of, on the surface, you can say, oh, they keep saying the same thing, that they need to put the focus on the content. Yes, like the overall idea is unchanged from 7 years ago. However, what's different today is that compact UI means it needs to be compact, because there may be a device where the screen is going to be extremely small, and therefore it makes sense to have a UI that can function in a compact mode as much as possible. And so I think it plays well in this context, but I also think it plays well in the context of the current trend of rounded elements and these buttons with padding around them. I think they lend themselves very well to that kind of compact aesthetic.
Yeah, I think there's a little something else going on too that's maybe kind of at the crossroads between design and the actual development work. And that is, with iOS 7, part of the message was, if you use our standard UI elements, you can get awfully far without having to do a lot of design work. I mean, that was the whole idea back with iOS 7. And that really led to an explosion of new developers coming on the scene, because you could do that work without having to hire someone for thousands of dollars to create that, incredibly detailed UI. And now we're in a similar position where Apple's trying to encourage developers to move their apps over to the Mac from the iPad. And so I think there's an element of that going on as well, where, the message from Apple is, look, if you use the standard UI elements in your iPad app, you're not going to have a ton of work to do to bring this over to the Mac. Now, it's more complicated than that, as most things are, but it does give you a head start that you wouldn't have if you're doing something very custom. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Pingdom from SolarWinds. Today's internet users expect a fast web experience. No matter how good your content or how effective your marketing, they'll most likely bounce if your website is loading too slowly. With real user monitoring from Pingdom, you can discover how website performance issues affect your visitors' experience. so you can take action before your business is impacted. How your visitors experience your website differs depending on your browser, device, and platform they use. So you want to identify how visitors are experiencing your website so you can make an informed optimization and deliver a great performance for those who matter the most. Real user monitoring is an event-based solution, so it's built for scalability, meaning you can monitor millions of page views without compromising the fidelity of your historical data or breaking the bank in the process. Get live visitor insights today with real user monitoring from Pingdom. Go to pingdom.com/signup right now for a 14-day free trial with no credit card required. Then, when you're ready to sign up, use the code AppStories at checkout to save an awesome 30% off your first invoice. Again, that's pingdom.com/signup and the code AppStories for 30% off your first invoice. Our thanks to Pingdom from Solar Winds for their support of the show. All right, Federico, I want to move over to talking a little bit about functionality, get beyond just kind of the surface gloss and talk about how apps work, because, I think the apps that to me are the very best designed apps are the ones where they pay attention to even the smallest details. And the kinds of things I'm talking about are very small details. For instance, when I have a keyboard replacement shortcut for my email address, my personal email address, because I hate having to type my email address every time I want to log into a site. Well, when I come upon a login screen in an app, first thing I wonder, is it gonna actually use the smart suggestions and offer to just drop my email address in there? And that's great if they do. If they don't, and I type in my shortcut and then it expands into the full thing, iOS puts a space at the end of that email address. And if I then put in my password and hit sign in, oftentimes it fails. You know why? Because it's not a valid email address because it has a space at the end. And that is something that in code you can trim off, but too many people don't. And another pet peeve are things like apps where there's a view, like a tab in a tab bar app that's for searching some sort of database, whether it's online or local, and the cursor isn't automatically in the search field. It should be in the search field if the whole idea is to search. It's little things like that that just add up over time, especially when you're doing them over and over again in a particular app, where they kind of wear you down and you start wondering, does the person really understand how people use the app in the first place? It's those little shortcuts, the one less tap, those kinds of things that really can make a difference between an okay app and a really outstanding one.
Right. Yeah, I guess something that I find really, really challenging anytime I watch design videos, or sometimes designers, they do these like time-lapse videos showing them designing user interfaces, is just how difficult it is. And it's no surprise that, some of these folks have been studying this craft for decades. How difficult it is to balance having something that is pretty to look at, that is nice to look at, but also something that is functional, but also obviously functional. And by that, I mean something that, maybe invites the user to tap and to touch and interact with the specific element. And sometimes, for example, now there's this whole what do they call it, neomorphism design trend, which would be the idea of like this very, very light and white user interfaces with like lots of shadows, but to me, at least in my opinion, very poor legibility.
Yeah, it all looks like kind of white molded plastic, kind of, right?
Yes, it looks like white plastic. That's a really good description of it. And which brings me to this point of, there's the problem, especially on Apple platforms, because the company cares so much about it, of balancing the visuals of an interface and the function of it, but also right there in the middle, there's the accessibility of it. And, sometimes we think of accessibility as a very niche and specific market, because in the world, there are fewer individuals with vision impairments or hearing impairments than normally able people. And which is why Apple insists on these functionalities so much because they are so important to the people that need them on a daily basis. But I think it's wrong to think of accessibility as just something that, I hear some folks say, oh, why do you care about accessibility? For example, in my reviews, in my iOS reviews, I always have at the very least a section with some of the highlights for accessibility changes. And usually every year we have our friend Stephen Aquino doing stories about accessibility on Mac Stories because we think it's important. But also, I hear, every time I hear folks saying, "No, who cares about that? I don't have any vision impairments, or I don't have any hearing loss. Why do I care about VoiceOver?" And I think the problem there is that the accessibility features in iOS go well beyond a specific set of features for very specific users. Every kind of design, I think, at least to me, needs to be accessible design. You can see this in the simplest options in iOS, like dynamic text, for example. Right. How many times did you have to change the font size because maybe you just went to the eye doctor and you were seeing funny with your eyes and you needed to bump up the font size? I mean, that happened to me a bunch of times.
Sure.
And I don't use the proper accessibility features, but that's also an accessibility feature in itself. So what I think is really challenging in balancing form and function, visuals and functionality, I think is striking that middle ground where it's not just that, oh, this button looks like a button and it's nice to look at, so I guess I'll ship it. But all the other considerations, which I think is so difficult, all the other considerations that go into, okay, for example, do people who are colorblind, can they interpret this color correctly? Or is the thickness of the line that underlines this specific label, is it thick enough? Like all these very specific and small considerations, I think they also need to be mentioned when it comes to form and function, because there's a vast sea of these tiny details that, however, they are so important to a lot of people, and not just people who need the very specific accessibility stuff, but you may also need it one day, even though you wouldn't consider yourself an accessibility user. You know what I mean?
Right. No, I absolutely understand. I mean, it's accessibility in kind of the broadest possible sense. I mean, even a game that I recently reviewed, Good Sudoku by Zach Gage, that game...
Oh, I love how you pronounce it. Is that how you pronounce it in America?
I don't know. How would you pronounce it?
Sudoku.
All right. Well,
I have never heard of Sudoku. Did you say Sudoku? No, I mean, it's probably Sudoku. The way to say it in Sudoku.
Well, I'm not going to say it again because I'm probably wrong. There's a new game by Zach Gage, and it's really good.
In Italy, we just pronounce it the way it's written. So
yeah,
that's basically how Italian works as a language.
Well, no, I think that probably the Italian, you've got one on me on this one, Federico. But it is an incredibly accessible game in its own right, just because what it's done is it has taken a game that when it's played on paper has a lot of friction and a lot of frustration, because you have to kind of test different numbers that you put in different boxes, and it can get very messy and complicated and frustrating very quickly, especially if you're a beginner. And the game, it uses the power of the iPhone and the iPad to run an AI in the background that can tell what all the different possible moves are. And if you just back yourself into a corner, it allows you to back up and start over. So it's not just about playing the game, it's about teaching you the game and teaching you the techniques to play the game. And it's really, to me, it was a great example of great design, because it took a game that I've played in the past and found frustrating and never really stuck with, and made it accessible for me in the sense that it wiped away all those frustrations, and instead I got to the fun part right away. And so I enjoyed playing the game immediately without having to go through this steep learning curve of figuring out what I'm doing. It gave me hints where I wanted them. It showed me how to use different techniques, and kind of, let me use as many of the training wheels as I needed or wanted as I started playing the game. until I didn't need them anymore, and I could, play it on maybe a little more sophisticated level, if you follow me.
Yeah, and I think what's also important and interesting to talk about is how form and function in some of the best apps and some of the best system features, they blend together, and they sort of
Right.
become one thing that it's sort of impossible to put your finger on it and say, oh, this is what I mean. It's more of like the cohesive package of the entire experience. I think some people would say you need to take a holistic approach to understand what it is. And to me, an example of that would be Reader, the RSS client.
Mm-hmm.
Something that has always struck me about Reader is how it's easier for me to. So if I think of Reader, in my mind, in my brain, I don't visualize necessarily the UI or the features. Something that comes to mind to me is the feel of Reader. Like,
okay.
My brain, for the term Reader, maybe the icon, but mostly the idea of this fluidly swiping across different panels of the user interface. And Reader has always been that way. Even before the iOS 7 redesign, I've been using Reader since 2010, I think. And it's always been true that it's this unique blend of extremely fluid gestures and polished design to the point where the two things become one. And so I think it's especially impressive, well, on the iPhone, because you can navigate the entire UI with one hand. You can just swipe with your thumb and you can switch from your accounts page to the subscription list to the article list. And on iPad, it's even more impressive because you got this bigger screen, right? And so you can see the multiple columns at once. And the UI per se is nothing revolutionary, right? I mean, it's a light background and very few UI elements. But the feel of it, so the combination of the form and the function, results in something that I think is greater than the sum of the two parts, and that in my mind is uniquely Reader. And so I feel like it's very rare to find these types of examples of something that you could break it down to the individual components, right? You could say, okay, the UI has these glyphs and these text labels, and the animations have this animation curve and these kinds of transitions, but really they don't pay justice to the whole product. And I feel like it's so impressive when you stumble upon something that works like that you can just feel that it's unique because of the combination of multiple factors.
Yeah, I think Things is very much in that camp too.
Yes, that's a very good example also.
Yeah, because I think what's really to me impressive about Things is that it's that way both when you're using it with touch and when you're using a keyboard, right? Because it's got a deep set of keyboard shortcuts and ability to navigate by the keyboard that very few apps have been able to accomplish. But even so, when you're using it just on your phone, dragging things around, you feel like you're actually working in the interface with your hands. I mean, there's that connection with the app and what you're doing with it that is really what I think touch devices are all about, and is accomplished especially well with an app like Things.
And there are some other really good examples, I think, on iOS, iPadOS, and the Mac. You can make the argument that on the iPhone, I mean, we just talked about it, but Castro is also a really good example, I think.
Yep.
This unique combination of unique features, very, very unique design that basically exudes personality. I mean, you look at a Castro screenshot and you can tell immediately, oh, that's Castro. But also the functionality, like this idea of grabbing episodes and dropping them in a queue using drag and drop. The two things, right? The look of Castro and the interactions within Castro sort of become one thing, and that's Castro, and you can immediately identify that. And so, and also, I want to mention Tot for iOS
good one to mention.
and the Mac, because design-wise, there are some really thoughtful touches, but it's not a complex UI, right? It doesn't have it's not the kind of app where you open it and you go like, oh my god, look at this very photorealistic icon.
What am I supposed to do?
Right?
Because it's just a text field, right?
It's just a text field, and you can start typing, but then you see these dots, right? And the dots are both a visual indicator, but they're also a key navigation element of thought. And so, I think we should celebrate these kinds of products where it's not just that they're pretty to look at, it's not just that they are minimalistic or elegant, and it's also not just that they are powerful, but it's how the designers and the developers, right? Because this is as much a design job as it is a development job. They were able to work together and unify the two parts and achieve a kind of interaction that is, again, I keep coming back to this idea, like the perfect blend of design and function. When you use it, you can instantly, and there are multiple, there are different positive effects for this kind of thing. Like when I use Reader, I feel at home. I think it's intuitive, it's fast, it makes me feel good about browsing my RSS feeds. And when I use Thought, I also feel like I can save my ideas as quickly as possible, and it doesn't get in the way. There are no menus to worry about, and it's super fast to navigate. So the kind of product, the kind of app that makes you feel good when you use it, I think that's such an abstract idea to pin down, but also it's the kind of thing that you know it when you see it, right?
Right. And I think another element of an app like Tot is that there's a familiarity no matter what platform you're using it on, but it also takes advantage of each platform. So, it's got a menu bar app on the Mac, which makes a lot of sense for an app like that. And, I'd put kind of MindNode in this category too, because across all of Apple's devices, MindNode is very familiar, very clean UI, very easy to use. All you have to do is really start typing and hit enter, and you've got, your first node on your mind map, and it's really easy from there just to kind of figure out how to add boxes and lines and connect things, and it does a great job too of kind of giving you suggestions, keeping you from fiddling too much with the design yourself and customizing how it looks. Those tools are there, but it has a great base set of themes itself that look good and you can rely on if you don't want to get bogged down in changing colors and adding stickers and all those sorts of things. All right, Federico, for the last bit of this conversation, I want to talk to you a little bit about apps where you just kind of throw design out the window because you need the functionality. And I know that you and I both have some apps like this. They're the kind of apps that unfortunately you feel necessary to tuck away in a folder somewhere because they maybe don't look so great, but they're necessary. And I was thinking about what these apps were on my iPhone and iPad, and a lot of them are HomeKit apps for device manufacturers, because I'll tell you, there are very, very few device manufacturers who make hardware who also make good apps. I don't know if it's that they don't invest the same kind of effort and money that they do into the actual hardware or what, but a lot of those apps aren't great, which is why I'm glad for the Home app, even though I have some issues with its design as well. It's still far better than most of the device manufacturers' apps. And on top of that, another one, I've got a new app that I've been testing out that allows me to monitor over Bluetooth the levels of my USB audio interface. And this app, I sent you a screenshot. It is not a pretty sight, but it is really nice on like the iPad mini where, I can look at this screen and I can see what the levels are. I can start a recording. I can stop it. I can do all sorts of things like that. Now, why don't you mention a couple of yours? I know you've got at least one that's one of your music players that you've been using.
Yeah, Neutron music player. We had an entire episode of Connected about it a while back, and I was probably a little too harsh on it. But it's not the prettiest app on the App Store.
Yeah, it works really well, but it's not beautiful, right? That's kind of the way it is.
It really isn't, but it's amazing. Like functionally speaking and technically speaking, it is incredible what Neutron can do. It's honestly like mind-boggling what you can do with this application if you have a library of high resolution audio to listen to. Like, it's incredible, but it doesn't look great, right? But that's where at some point it becomes a compromise of this application is kind of confusing and it's hard to navigate. It's not intuitive. It doesn't make me feel good when I look at it and when I interact with it. However, the functionality that it brings me, the things that it allows me to do are unique, and there's no competition for it. And so I have to use it because it allows me to do something that no other app can. And I think I'm trying to think of other examples of applications that are like this for me. And I'm kind of struggling. I mean, you can make the case for, for example, I know that they're working on a big update for iOS 14. But no, actually, no. Honestly, like, I'm looking at my home screen right now, John, and most of the apps that I have they look pretty good, I would say.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you're not gonna. What you really need to do is you need to dig around in those folders. But you're right there. I mean, I think you can, if you look.
No, I have another example. Example. So the functionality is incredible, and over the years, the design has gotten a lot better. But when it first came out many years ago, AutoSleep, the sleep tracking utility for iPhone and Apple Watch, in its very first version, was very confusing, right? And but even though it was very confusing, I kept using it because the functionality was unique and because it allowed me to do something that no other utility could do for me. And so I think that now, of course, it's gotten a lot better, but I'm thinking of the original version. But yeah, there are these utilities sometimes that even though they're not, it's not just that they're not pretty or that they have an ugly icon. It's just that they are badly designed. But despite that, because they're so situational, right? You can use them and you need to use them.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of times it falls into the category of something's a very niche app or it's a companion app to some other process or thing that you're doing, something like that, which means that maybe the time wasn't spent on it that you would have liked. But, for the most part, I think you can find something in the App Store for anything you want that is, that has a good design. And it's not just that, I mean, we like to look at pretty things. I mean, a beautiful app is nice to use, but it also has to kind of, I think, to round out the conversation, is it's more than skin deep in the sense that part of the design is how it works. And if you can put those two things together and balance them well, you can really create an interesting and kind of innovative app. Okay, Federico, good discussion. I'm really looking forward to this fall. I know that you've been asking people to share with you some of their widgets and other apps that are coming in the fall, and it looks like developers have a lot in store for us this fall, so it's time to start getting excited. I want to thank our sponsor again for this episode, and that is Pingdom. Of course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram, where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.